American National Government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 2 of the American Constitution. The learning objectives for this segment is to consider and identify the historical antecedents to the Constitution and explain the major deficiencies in the Articles of Confederation that led to the Constitution that is now the basis for American government. So let's take a look at the promise of the Constitution. First of all, the historical antecedents of the Constitution were the Declaration of Independence. But we got there based upon a variety of historical and global events that led to concerns as well as discontent within the colonists. But beyond that, the Declaration of Independence wasn't just the starting point. It led to the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at governance, and a failed attempt at governance, which in turn led to the Constitution itself. So we'll take a look at the economic conditions, and we'll also take a look at group rivalries and the movement for a convention. So when we're considering the historical antecedents of the Constitution, what we're considering is that Thomas Jefferson, before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and before John Hancock was the first to sign it in July of 1776, there were events that came about that led to this. So let's take a look at those events. The first was the French and the Indian War. Now, interestingly enough, the French and Indian War wasn't the French versus the Indian. It was the French and the Indians versus the colonists, and specifically Great Britain. And this was a part of the 7 Years' War, which saw Great Britain and France fight a global war. Indeed, this might be considered the First World War in the sense that there was battles going on in continental Europe, in India, in Cuba, the Philippines, as well as the colonies, as both of these major powers contended for global domination. Now, from the very start, this was about economic power of empire. And the idea of the North American or the Indian lands, of course the Native Americans, was a major component of this. And so what happened here is the colonists in fighting this war were first introduced to guerrilla warfare. And what we're talking about with guerrilla warfare is we're looking at Native Americans who did not fight battles according to the ways that the Europeans did. They just applied their own approaches, which relied upon a high level of mobility and sneak attacks. And it was very successful, especially the Iroquois Confederacy brought together groups that were very effective in fighting off Great Britain. Now, the 7 Years' War, beyond the fact that it led to certainly battles, it led to a doubling of Britain's national debt, as well as increasing the cost of running the North American colonies fivefold. So what we're seeing here is an incredible cost increase with not necessarily a high level of benefits to the Great Britain and its colonies. So the question is how do you pay for the empire? Well, you tax, and this taxing of the empire and taxing of trade was something that led to ultimately the loss of the colonies and the destruction of a major component of the British Empire. So the Stamp Act was the first approach here, and this is in March of 1765. It was the first direct tax on the colonies. And what we saw here was a revenue stamp had to be purchased for public documents. Now, these public documents included such things as mortgages, wills, contracts, newspapers, and even playing cards, which, of course, was not very popular. Now, this led to the boycotting of English goods and the attacking of British agents by the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were organized by the hardest hit classes, which weren't necessarily the poorest classes. They were the businesses, the professional classes, although the economic depression affected all the classes, including the lower classes. Now, ultimately, this was repealed after the Stamp Act Congress petitioned. And what happened is it said that only the representatives of the people of these colonies are persons chosen therein by themselves, and no taxes have ever been or can be constitutionally imposed on them but by their respective legislatures. So what we're seeing here is the first sign of self-determination. The idea that, okay, tax us, but if we're going to be taxed, we have to be able to vote on it. Now, the next attempt at taxation were the Townshend Acts, and this was in June of 1767. And the idea here was to impose higher duties on imported glass, paper, and tea. Now, they're named for Charles Townshend, who moved away from revenue stamps, but figured that the best way to tax is actually go back to tariffs on the imported goods and tighten the customs administration in the colonies, especially where evasion and smuggling were rampant. Now, this led to the same response as the Stamp Acts. So ultimately what we saw was the tea tax, and this happened about 5 years later in May of 1773. Now, ultimately, we're taxing only tea, but we have to remember that tea is a really incredibly powerful economic good that many people came to rely upon. Think about taking away your coffee and how that would influence your life. Now, it wasn't just a tax on tea, but it also gave a monopoly to the East India Company. So as a form of bailout, well before the bailouts that we've seen in our own country. And it was the idea that we had one corporation that had incredible power throughout to the world. And in addition to giving this bailout, it also was an attempt to control smuggling and the trade that came about that was illegal this way. Now, what happened here ultimately is what we know as the Boston Tea Party, in which 60 men dressed as Native Americans dumped 340 chests of tea into the water. And what happened from this is Paul Revere went south from Boston and spawned new tea parties in its wake. So this right here was certainly one of the major starting points or focusing events for the revolution. This led to the breaking away from the mother country. Essentially, it was almost a point of no return. Here we see John Adams, who is the intellectual leader of the Boston protest. And his diary entry suggests that he was very much seeing that this was a step to move away. And he states, "The objects before me are too grand and multifarious for my comprehension. We have not men fit for the times. We are deficient in genius, in education, in travel, in fortune, in everything. I feel unutterable anxiety." So while he's seeing this move away, he's also feeling a sense of anxiety and fear over the fact that the people who we now revere as the founders and as incredible intellects were just not up to the task. But this led to the Declaration of Independence, which lays a foundation of American constitutional theory. And what we're seeing here is that justified the struggle for independence on the concept of natural rights. We have the statement ultimately of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the provision of the basis of Republican government. But more than anything, it sets up the basic idea that the sovereign power of the people, and if I can go ahead, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." In other words, power rises from the people, from their consent. This led to the first form of government, the Articles of Confederation, and it was the first constitution in the United States. It was established as a national government with a unicameral legislature. In other words, there was just representatives from each of the states, and they were equally represented. And there's no independent executive or judiciary branch. Now, the national government's power was limited primarily to raising army and a navy and entering into treaties and alliances and sending and receiving diplomatic representatives. But the truth of it is because it had no authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce or levy taxes, it was incredibly weak, and this led to its downfall. Now, state constitutions themselves led to provide models of government. Most states had a governor chosen by the legislature. Some had a strong governor system. Most often, the state judiciaries were weak and subservient to legislatures, and most states put term limits on legislatures and allowed for the recall of officials. So, in other words, the idea was the state governments were too weak to be effective. So, what we saw here is a desire to not have too much power in the government. In other words, there was a fear of the sort of government that was overwhelmingly powerful that was seen with Great Britain, which was exercising its control across the ocean. Now, ultimately, the economic conditions in the few years after the end of the Revolutionary War led to a depression, and this depression was worsened by interstate competition. And the national government itself was powerless to regulate interstate commerce. So what we saw is that debtors used the political process to lighten their financial obligations. They did through such things as stay laws, bankruptcy, and issuing of cheap paper money. So what we saw is a form of trade wars between the states themselves, which in turn set the stage for the new Constitution. This is American national government.